Well guys, it's that time of week and we're back with another Family Guy review. This week we are going to be covering Family Guy's latest episode as of the time of this recording, Season 22, Episode 11, titled Teacher's Heavy Pet. Needless to say, this is a jaw-dropper of an episode revolving around Chris pretending he is secretly sleeping with Lois in an attempt to become popular with the other boys at his school. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down the plot of the episode, then give my overall thoughts and rate the episode between 1 and 5 stars. But first, if you guys like videos like these and you want to keep up with these reviews, please consider subscribing and hitting the bell so you can be notified as these videos release. Now, with all that out of the way, let's begin. The episode begins with Peter and Lois attending a high school football game, and immediately after entering the high school, Lois is roasted by a PTA parent working at a muffin stand. After Lois gets roasted, the Griffins enter the stadium and take their seats as Principal Shepard welcomes everyone and announces the retirement of a teacher named Mr. Trampledon. Now, you would think with a name like that, I would expect the joke that would follow up, but I was prepared for Family Guy to do one of their signature time wasters, which this scene could have easily turned into. But to my surprise, the scene didn't drag and it got a shock humor laugh out of me. After this, Chris is crowned the homecoming dunce for the 4th year in a row, despite him only attending Adam West High School for 2 years. Right off the bat, I guess we have a current continuity fact, as this episode confirms that Chris is a sophomore. After Chris receives his reward, he is upset about being the homecoming dunce, because the bullying each year keeps on getting worse after he receives it. Chris lets this be known to Brian while he vents, but the two of them are interrupted as Lois walks into the scene and announces her news to the family, letting them know that she got hired at Adam West High School.
What?
Seriously?
I don't know if that's mute the TV news.
Brian and Chris are confused at first, pointing out to Lois that she should need a master's degree, but Lois justifies her lying by calling it manifesting, so she takes the job under the name Lois Peterschmidt and puts on a disguise. Right away, I like that the show is trying to stick to some level of continuity, as Lois has worked at Adam West High School before as a music teacher. Now, that being said, Meg did point out to a class full of students that Lois's original name was Lois Peterschmidt, but really thinking about it, Connie D'Amico and her group full of friends not remembering something like that really isn't out of character for them because they're so self-centered.
LG.
Lois Griffin.
Wait, but weren't you Lois Peterschmidt back then?
Meg, go to the principal's office.
Back to the episode, Lois is greeted by Principal Shepard, who introduces her to the class she will be teaching. When Lois enters the class, Chris's classmates immediately begin leering at her, which makes Chris uncomfortable. Later that day, during lunch, Chris gets a text from Lois telling him that she is going to drive him home after school. After receiving the text from Lois, Chris is called over by the popular kids, who ask him why he wasn't checking out Mrs. Peterschmidt. During this scene, Chris is uncomfortable because he doesn't want to give up the ruse that Lois is his mom and get her fired for not actually having a master's degree. So Chris decides to bite the bullet and lists off all the things that he would like to do to her. After a few jokes, we cut to Chris getting a ride from Lois, and a few popular kids spot the two of them together and assume Mrs. Peterschmidt and Chris are hooking up. In the following scene, Chris is asked by his classmates as to whether or not he hooked up with Mrs. Peterschmidt, so Chris uses some clever phrases to get around the truth but still impress his peers. Chris's classmates hold him up over their shoulders and carry him out like he's a legend, which almost reminds me of how the crowd cheered for Donnie Berger in the movie That's My Boy. Later that day, Lois talks to Chris while he is in the hallway and congratulates him on making new friends, and we later cut to Meg confronting Chris about a rumor she heard about Chris sleeping with Mrs. Peterschmidt. Chris tries to justify his actions by saying the rumor is making him cool, but Meg stands her ground and informs Chris that their mom could be arrested. Chris makes it clear that he is going to keep up the charade, and we cut to Chris at the lunch tables again, but this time with the popular kids. While Chris is with his peers, he oversells his story, and they begin to get suspicious, so they tell Chris that they want some evidence of him actually hooking up with Mrs. Peterschmidt, so they demand a naked picture. Chris nervously agrees after being sent away from the popular table, and we cut to him working up the courage to follow through with his plan. Now, while Chris enters the bathroom, we get by far the funniest scene in the episode, where Quagmire appears in the room hidden by a camouflage of the walls and the bathroom towels.
I can't. It's my mom. I'm not a dirtbag.
Psst, Chris. That it has even gone this far means you are a dirtbag.
Quagmire then encourages Chris to follow through with his plan because he's already in too deep. Chris takes Quagmire's advice and snaps the picture, then he shows it off to his peers during class. The two jocks then request Chris to send them the picture, and after Chris hesitantly agrees, it spreads across the school like wildfire. Eventually, the news about the student and Mrs. Pewterschmidt gets back to Principal Shepard, so he calls Lois into his office. While Lois is in Principal Shepard's office, the two of them have a misunderstanding as Lois confesses to lying about her master's degree. Principal Shepard is relieved after hearing she isn't sleeping with any of her students, but he informs her that the whole thing was brought to his attention because of a picture that was sent to him. Lois reassures Principal Shepard that she knows who did it and that she would handle it. After this, we cut to Peter congratulating Chris because he believes he is sleeping with the teacher, but then Lois storms in and confronts Chris in front of Peter, telling him what Chris has done. Peter then gets up and leaves for a bit, saying that he is going to go check Reddit. Something I want to point out is that in the rest of the scene, Peter essentially ignores his family and keeps himself preoccupied, which is something that makes sense within Peter's character. If you remember, in an earlier episode, Peter was confronted with a situation like this involving Meg and Chris, and Peter admitted that he didn't have the parenting skills to deal with something like this.
Chris, our bath is ready.
I don't know what to do now. I don't have the parenting skills necessary to deal with this.
Back to the episode, Lois confronts Chris and she tells him that he is going to have to tell everyone the truth. After this, Chris and Lois have a sweet moment as he tells her that he just lied because he wanted to be cool, which warms her heart because she claims he was manifesting, and the two of them share a hug. The next day, Chris stands in front of his class and tells them the truth, which causes his classmates to label him as a loser. Mrs. Pewterschmidt then steps in and lies to her class, saying that she slept with Chris and that he was the biggest she ever had, and the students carry Chris out like he's a hero as the episode ends with a joke of Lois receiving 6 years in jail. So now I'm going to give my overall thoughts on the episode. Honestly, I thought this episode was pretty damn funny. I know a lot of people might ask themselves, did this episode go too far? And I don't really think they crossed any boundaries that they haven't crossed before. We have seen Chris and Meg hook up in a Halloween special, and we have seen Meg try to push Chris to his limits as well by drugging him so that she could find out about him hooking up with Kent. Overall, this episode doesn't nearly cross the line as much as some of the other episodes from Seth MacFarlane's show. One of the ones that comes to mind immediately is the American Dad episode where Francine had been secretly breastfeeding Steve his whole life. I also appreciated that this episode did a good job of making sure that the students were under the impression that it was Mrs. Pewterschmidt and not Lois, and I'm glad that the episode didn't end with them finding out that it was Lois all along. I also liked how Lois and Chris both understood where their lies ended them up, and it was sweet to see them both care for one another. Something I really appreciated in this episode is that they didn't have any time waster jokes, and I also liked that this episode paid attention to small details, like showing Lois's fake mole and the suds covering her hair, so that it doesn't blow Lois's cover to the other students. There's also a scene where one of the characters changes into a sweater between scenes before throwing it off and saying that he didn't actually need it, and it was a funny attention to detail because you would never notice that he had a sweater between scenes, and I found that this episode has quite a few blink and you miss it background commentary jokes that I just found really funny on rewatch. So between the writers paying attention to previous episodes and for the attention to details I mentioned earlier, I think the writers and animators deserve some props. However, there are still a few jokes and scenes that may rub people the wrong way, such as a BLM joke, a football injury joke, and a Lois being sent to sensitivity training joke. Also, when Lois and Principal Shepard have their misunderstanding towards the end of the episode, the show leans in on the joke in a way that just makes everyone uncomfortable. But on the topic of jokes, it was an unexpected surprise when about 2/3 of the way through the episode, we got to hear the song Good Riddance by Green Day. Obviously, I can't play the song because of copyright, but to my knowledge, this is the first time a Green Day song has ever appeared in a Family Guy episode. Another joke I obviously loved was Quagmire's talk to Chris in the bathroom, and when Chris tells the popular kids what he and Mrs. Pewterschmidt are doing, and he just references adult films. For my final thoughts, my biggest problem with this episode is how Chris just succumbs to peer pressure across the entire episode. He pretty much just goes with the flow and does what people tell him to do, whether it's the popular kids, Quagmire, or Lois telling him to fess up at the end. The The only time throughout the episode he shows some backbone is to Meg, but by then he was already in too deep. Aside from that, unlike with last week's episode we reviewed, Cabin Pressure, this episode doesn't rush into crunch time at the end, and it actually has a natural conclusion. Overall, I think this episode turned out better than I expected, and it was definitely more memorable than last week's episode. So, for this review, I'm going to give Family Guy Season 22, Episode 11, Teacher's Heavy Pet, 3 out of 5 stars. This episode isn't terrible, and it has some funny jokes with a conclusive, consistent plot, which sometimes can be a lot to ask for from Family Guy. Alrighty guys, if you like videos like these and you want to keep up with my Family Guy reviews, please consider subscribing and hitting the bell so you can be notified as these videos release. Alrighty guys, you all take care, have a good one.